broadcasting from Tower Studio with your anchors, Katie McCoy and Ellie Pomeroy, bringing you the latest in Blue Gold News. This is Blue Gold News Now.
Good evening, I'm Ellie Pomerlew.
And I'm Katie McCoy.
On tonight's episode of BNN, we will have a special segment that we call Ask Your Professor.
In this segment, we will bring on professors who have expertise on major breaking news or conflicts. Tonight, we have Dr. Turner with us, who is a professor of history and interim chair of the history department.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background in history?
Well, I've been teaching here for about 20 years, and I am a modern European historian. So I teach, one of the courses I teach is Modern Europe. I also teach a course on the origin of current world conflicts, of which I'm not teaching it this semester. It would have been very interesting if I had been. So I approach the topic of the war in Ukraine right now from a more Western perspective. But that, of course, in my teaching does include Russia, so happy to contribute what I can.
Yes. So yes, as you just mentioned, our questions tonight will focus on the history surrounding the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, so first we're just going to begin talking a little bit about the nation's histories. So do you think the histories of these nations play an important role in the conflict? And if so, why?
Well, absolutely, and not just because I'm an historian and think anything about history is relevant to the present, but because this is a case of a clear aggression, and Putin uses history to justify it. In his speech he gave the day the invasion began, it's riddled with references to history, that NATO had betrayed promises back in the 90s, that in fact Ukraine is historically this part of Russia, that Ukrainians are Russian. And he wrote, in fact, last July, and which he kept referencing, this on the historic unity of Russia and Ukraine. So he sees not that Russians are Ukrainian, but Ukrainians are Russian. And so therefore, any effort to establish a separate sovereignty, he sees as violating some fundamental union that predates, in fact, the Soviet Union. So he goes that far back, which is why I brought in the prop that I'll talk about in a minute. So yes, absolutely. Now, the Ukrainians have an entirely different point of view. In their view, in fact, when the Soviet Union was founded back in, after the revolution in 1917, initially Ukraine tried to establish its own independence from what had been the Russian Empire. And they failed, but they were allowed to become a Ukrainian socialist republic. And they were recognized as such all the way through the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union always recognized it as something distinctly separate. Putin does not. So he's using his view and rewriting of history in order to justify this conflict. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, is saying that we were recognized in the Soviet Union as an independent republic. We became independent when the Soviet Union collapsed. We've been independent ever since. And not only that, we have our own language. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine has now broken away from the Russian Orthodox Church. We have our own culture. We're not Russian.
Right.
So that's the dividing line.
For sure, yeah. So there's definitely completely different views between Russia and Ukraine. So would you say the key factor in that is Putin's perspective?
Absolutely.
All right, for sure.
And his ambitions.
And his ambitions, okay.
Yes, which he doesn't think he can realize without Ukraine. So, yeah.
For sure.
It makes it difficult. It's difficult to see how you resolve this because of that. Because he has a lot at stake, and he doesn't want to lose face. So this was supposed to be a 3-day special military operation. So.
Yep.
So kind of like transitioning to Putin himself, can you give us like a brief history of his presidency and like what his previous role in Russia was?
Well, he was a KGB officer. Okay, so in fact, back in I think World War II, his brother died in St. Petersburg when it was being bombed by the Nazis. So he, I mean, he's, what is he, 69, 70 years old now?
Right,
and
yep.
In any case, so he goes way, then he later got involved in the Soviet Union, of course, in the KGB. Yeltsin, who took over as the Soviet Union was collapsing, Gorbachev, the previous president, had been or general secretary, had been kidnapped and then was released. And then in the ensuing chaos, as countries like Ukraine were becoming independent, Yeltsin kind of stepped in. But he didn't know really how to run the country. And as the Soviet Union collapsed, there was enormous economic instability. Yeltsin had health problems. He had drinking problems. And his solution finally in 1999 was to have an appointed successor, and that was Putin. And then he could resign. And Putin came to power despite his KGB past sort of promising to be somewhat the moderate who would restore Russia and bring it back to economic health and such. And for the first several years, he did very much sort of act like the moderate, including supporting the US with the war in Iraq and against Afghanistan. But I don't think that it was never his intention to sort of moderate into a democracy. Russia's never been a democracy. It doesn't have any democratic traditions. And Putin never really saw himself as the leader of one. So this isn't new, even if I think the West ignored some real warning signs. Putin invaded Georgia in 2008 when they were looking to become more of the West. He took over Crimea and annexed it in 2014. So this is really sort of the latest step.
So you might have just mentioned this a little bit, but how did the collapse of the Soviet Union lead to the rise of Putin, or did it at all?
Well, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was, I mean, many could say it was somewhat of a long time coming. The Soviet Union was tremendously in debt by the time of the collapse. Wasn't really known about it in the West at the time, but in retrospect, we now know. And the reason why Ukraine and Georgia and Belarus and such could become independent was there was this article in the Constitution of 1977 of the Soviet Union that said any republic could succeed on its own if it wished to. Now, if you looked at the other articles, it was very clear that they wouldn't be allowed to. But here, the Soviet Union is rocking in instability, and basically Ukraine and Georgia and Belarus and others took advantage of that and said, all right, here's our moment. And they said, we want to invoke this article. And in that ensuing instability, the Soviet Union basically said, we recognize it, we accept it. And the Soviet Union literally broke apart into its republics. And some chose to stay, and that became the Russian Federation, which it is today. Some didn't choose to stay, but were forced to, and that's Chechnya, which fought a horrible civil war for almost a decade against the former Soviet Union, trying to become independent. Putin would ultimately brutally put that down when he comes to power. So that's the backdrop for understanding an independent Ukraine. It declared independence, and at that moment became the second largest country in Europe. The first is Russia. People don't realize how big Ukraine is. It's not very wealthy. It's a developing country still. But in terms of territory, in terms of minerals, in terms of, it's got a lot to offer. And agricultural, grain, there might be a famine in Africa, increased famine, because if the Ukrainian harvest, if they can't plant their wheat. So anyway, this is an important loss for the Russian Federation.
Speaking of, that mass of resources, Europe itself has been dependent on Russia, specifically for energy resources throughout history. What did that look like?
Okay, as usual, these are complicated stories, so I'm going to keep it as simple. The real dependency grows in the 80s, 1980s. Prior to that, you still have the Cold War in the 1980s until the revolution of 1989, and the countries of Eastern Europe become, well, let's say the Iron Curtain falls. Let's put it that way. And the U.S., like it had been before, was against the Western Europe in particular. Eastern Europe already relied entirely on gas and oil from Russia. And that dated back to, you might have heard from the history books, the Marshall Plan after World War II,
Yes.
in which the United States, tremendous loans and grants to Western, they offered it to all of Europe, but the Soviet Union said nothing in its zone could accept it. And so the Soviet Union came up with an alternative plan. We, instead of giving you billions of dollars in today's money, we will give you cheap gas and oil. And that continued all the way up until the Soviet Union collapsed. And then after that, countries like Poland and Hungary and East Germany that had become independent, Germany obviously had unified, they remained relying on this cheap source of energy. But in Western Europe, France, Britain and such, in the 1980s, when Russian gas was so cheap, they started building pipelines despite the Reagan administration's time saying, hey, be careful to be dependent. And part of their argument was, if we get Russian dependent on us for buying the oil, then they're more likely to reform. They're more likely to join the West. This will be a good thing. Well, that's where it started.
Right. So it's a big history of dependency. Do you foresee a shift in this dependency because of the conflict, or do you think
Already
it's-
has.
All right.
Already has. Well, first of all, France has exports energy because of its nuclear power. It's a big, peaceful nuclear power country. It has nuclear weapons too, but Germany has been the real sticking point. And again, that dates back to the unification with East and West Germany, and East Germany's heavy reliance, almost entire reliance on Russia, which continued. Like I said, cheap, easy to obtain, natural gas in particular, but also oil. And so they were building to get around Ukraine because major pipelines go through Ukraine from Russia, pipelines called Nord Stream through the Baltic Sea. And it's basically complete.
Okay.
And as a result of this conflict, I think Germany surprised the West, the United States, by saying, we'll stop it. So now they have a completely built pipeline that, according to the German government, will never have natural gas coming through it. So now, can they get off entirely? That's an open question, because where OPEC, which is the other largest supplier of gas, we are one of them, we have of natural gas and oil, but OPEC has said we're not increasing production. So if they don't increase production, where is, how can you eliminate Russia as a source of oil and natural gas?
It's very interesting to think about. Kind of transitioning now from energy to NATO, which is kind of a big jump, but for students who may not know much about NATO, could you explain what it is and the role that it plays in our world?
Okay, so we go back to the beginning of the Cold War, which broke out within just a few years after the end of World War II. So by 1947, we have, the speeches calling it an Iron Curtain, and then the Berlin airlift, and later, 15 years later, the Berlin Wall. Okay, so in the midst of that, you have the formation of NATO, which is North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is basically an alliance of those allied with the United States, and they had, and it still is, which you hear the Article 5, which says if any member state is attacked, all the other states will consider it an act of war. So one is attacked, all are attacked. Now, the Soviet Union, within 5 or so years after that, created the Warsaw Pact, which is the equivalent. The Warsaw Pact collapsed with the Soviet Union. NATO didn't. And one of Putin's justifications for his special military operation in Ukraine is the argument that in the 90s, during the time of German unification, there were promises made that NATO would not expand to the east, quote, 1 inch. Now, it turns out that was a statement by then Secretary of State James Baker, and he, under George Herbert Washer Bush, the elder President Bush, and it was immediately walked back. And there's a really interesting book just came out a few years ago about this sort of complicated, were promises made, not really, but there is no doubt that as NATO expanded east, Russia was going to feel more and more threatened. right? And which is why Finland has yet to join NATO. It's right next to Russia. So that's where, that is the issue, is that if Ukraine were to join NATO, then Russia, it's basically Russia, it'll be off limits to Russia forevermore because of Article 5. Because Russia cannot defeat NATO unless they use nuclear weapons, which is why there's no no-fly zone. NATO has established no-fly zones. They did in Bosnia-Herzegovina, when Yugoslavia broke up in the 1990s. But Serbia and Montenegro and Herzegovina and Bosnia didn't have nuclear weapons. And so as President Biden has said bluntly, we can't start World War III. So no-fly zone over Ukraine.
I think you bring up a very important point in what NATO plays and how it's shifted, and especially, the brink of nuclear war, and how that's a question. And World War III is a question, which is crazy.
I know, it's crazy to think about.
In our modern political sphere, where you think that wouldn't be an issue anymore. Kind of shifting with that, and Putin's claims and drastic actions, I wanted to talk a little bit about war crimes. Something that's really been a question for a lot of organizations and people in general is Putin crossing the line? Is it coming to a point where he would be considered a war criminal? And so I wanted to bring up and ask you how the International Criminal Court has gone about the prosecution of war crimes. And do you think that this process would need to be applied to the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, need to and can be are two different things. The ICC, International Criminal Court, was only established in 2002. Prior to that, in order to bring those who'd committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, these are indictments that you really saw first in the Nuremberg trials against the Nazis in the aftermath of World War II. The Nazis obviously having been defeated and deposed, right? Then the ICC was the idea, instead of having these international tribunals that are brought for a specific case, why not have a standing body in which they could indict those in which there was convincing evidence and then put them on trial. Now, you can only put on trial those who are in countries that, or committed alleged crimes in countries that actually belong to the ICC.
Okay.
Now, the US and Russia were early strong sponsors in the 1990s. They helped organize the ICC. And then after 9/11 and after the invasion into Afghanistan, when we went into Afghanistan in response, we withdrew from the ICC. We unsigned it. And that was under the second Bush administration. Partly out of fear that perhaps our soldiers would do something in Afghanistan or later in Iraq, and then they could be perhaps held accountable before the ICC. Russia stayed in the ICC until 2016, and then Putin got out of it. So, which brings your point. In terms of the success of the ICC, I saw a study in 2020. They have investigated hundreds of cases that are legitimate and have evidence of war crimes or crimes against humanity. Only 45 have been indicted, and only 14, as of 2020, have been convicted. And one of the problems is this question of jurisdiction, because of countries in which they haven't signed on, so therefore they're sort of you can't hold them to account. Or two, the politics of putting on trial a head of state, right? Because states have sovereignty, and can you, an international court, say, no, we're going to ignore the sovereignty of the state and put on trial, like, for example, the president of Sudan. He has been indicted since 2009. He still hasn't been tried. They're still, quote, collecting evidence, right? And this was the former president of Sudan. So has Putin committed war crimes? Well, we have a president who's already accused him as a war criminal, right? And I think the evidence is going to be pretty overwhelming. Can he be indicted and convicted?
the justice.
The justice
might
system,
not
the
be
way,
set there, yep.
it currently, the strength of the ICC and the support for it and the fact that Russia doesn't belong to it makes that, I'd have to say, doubtful.
I think you bring up a very good point there. It's very difficult to get everyone to agree, not necessarily agree, but to execute on those agreements. And I guess just with that then, I noticed you brought an artifact in.
Yes, I did.
Would you like to share what that is about?
Yes, I will. Thank you. I brought two. One's just a piece of paper.
Okay.
But we were talking about history, right? And I would say we've got two histories here. We have this, which is actually, if you look at the presentations and the speeches of Zelensky recently, this is in the background of him much of the time. It is the Ukrainian coat of arms.
Okay.
It dates back, oh boy, at least some renditions of it, back to the medieval period when there was a prince of Kiev. And later, what's now Ukrainian became part of Poland and Lithuania, and then part of Russia, and then absorbed into the Russian Empire. But this symbol remained. When the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, this symbol was brought up again as an independent Ukraine. That lasted for a few years, and it became part of the Soviet Union. And then it became the coat of arms when Ukraine became independent after the Soviet Union collapsed. And it's called the small coat of arms. It's another complicated story. But the point is, this is the symbol of an independent, sovereign, non-Russian Ukraine. Now, so I brought that in. This is, there's a really great Russian name, but I speak French, I don't speak Russian, and so I won't even try to pronounce it. But it's often known as nesting dolls, and I'm sure you might have seen them, and they vary in terms of what the main figure is. In this case, we have Yeltsin. So this dates back to the mid-1990s when a very close girlfriend of mine who was doing research in Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed brought it back and gave it to me. And so Yeltsin was the one who appointed Putin, okay? And this is my chosen successor, and now I get to retire, right? And so when you open the doll, of course, you don't go forward, you go backwards in history. And there are a number of these political dolls, actually, depending on when they were made. So the next one you get is Gorbachev, who Putin constantly maligns because this is the man who comes to power in 1985 and is going to try to reform Russia, and actually, to be honest, did his best in perestroika to economically reform it, and glasnost to introduce openness and greater freedom of speech and maybe civil liberties at a time when Russia was becoming increasingly economic unstable, and he didn't succeed, okay? And he would be kidnapped and then have to resign, and Yeltsin took over. All right, so Putin says the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he blames Gorbachev for, was the single greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Not the Holocaust, not World War I, World War II, no, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, which brings us to the next doll.
Okay.
And now we do skip, my dolls are getting stuck. Here we go. We do skip a couple of general secretaries who only lived like 18 months, because the next one is Brezhnev. Brezhnev came to power after Khrushchev. Putin doesn't say much about Brezhnev. Khrushchev came to power when Stalin died. Stalin, who had a totalitarian state. Stalin, who always recognized Ukraine as an independent or separate republic. But during the 1930s, in order to collectivize the farms, I said Ukraine was a huge agriculture, today a state, we're talking up to 20 million deaths, starvation in Ukraine. Okay, so Putin often cites Stalin with some degree of nostalgia in terms of his power and his strength, okay? And then, but he actually doesn't agree with him because for all of Stalin's crimes against Ukraine, he always did recognize it as a separate, socialist republic. Which brings us to Lenin, who Putin blames, which is interesting. So Putin is not a communist, by the way. Putin blames Lenin because Lenin recognized these separate republics in the first place.
Okay.
And said, okay, this is going to be a separate republic in
recognized
Ukraine,
sovereignty
which
in
by, or at least you're going to be part of the Soviet Union, but we recognize you're a separate republic, which means you're a separate people, which is something
Yes,
that
yes.
Putin does not recognize, right? So here's Lenin, and that brings us to the person that Putin actually really does aspire to be. None of these, most of whom were the Soviet, right, general secretaries of the Soviet Union, the Tsar. That's Nicholas II. That's what Putin wants to be. He wants to bring back imperial Russia of the old Russian Empire, who I hopefully say is a very small man in this nesting doll. And so perhaps Putin's hopes and dreams and aspirations will be, in the long term, equally small.
For sure.
So.
Wow, that was, thank you so much for that
Yes.
presentation. It's clear that history plays an important role in this conflict.
Yes.
You gave so much background to this complicated issue. We really appreciate you coming on tonight and sharing that with us.
Well,
Yes.
it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
For sure.
Well, this has been another edition of Ask Your Professor.
Next week, we will introduce a new segment and bring back an old one.
I'm Katie McCoy.
And I'm Ellie Pomerlew. Thank you and good night.